Good morning. Welcome to Shaping Our Future, a Resilient Metro Vancouver 2050, convened by colleagues at Metro Vancouver and TransLink. We're so glad that you're able to join us this morning. My name is Susanna Haas-Lyons, and I am the host with Understanding Risk BC, and it's my pleasure to help support this session this morning.
In terms of just sort of setting up this breakout session, I think one of the challenges that we see here is that in some cases, data at the regional scale is produced on somewhat of an ad hoc basis. In some cases, we have data for some hazards and not others. And in some cases, we have data at local scales versus regional scales versus broader scales. And so it makes it challenging when we're trying to interpret that data and consider that data in terms of developing policy. So happy to hear from any folks on this call in terms of what hazards you think are sort of inherently regional in nature, and perhaps the risks are regional in nature, and why. So I might just open that up to the group, and perhaps we can just speak to that either in the chat or feel free to just unmute yourself and give a response.
So thanks for that. So the first question is about what hazards and risks are inherently regional scale and why? Would somebody be willing to unmute? And Ginger, thanks. And
well, okay, earthquake and flood. That is something we cannot plan for in isolation. Those are obvious.
I think fires and smoke.
I don't know if anybody's noticed, but we've seen the impact of a pandemic recently.
Climate change.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to speak to follow up on the first speaker when it comes to flood, because I think that's also a bit of a multi-layered one as well. You know, when I think of the impact of a regional scale, spring freshet versus more localized sea level rise flooding, versus areas of the region which experience different amounts of rainfall in sort of high sloped areas compared to others. There might be different ways to break down even just the flood hazard itself as well.
So I'd like to throw a little bit of complexity into the conversation. So looking at the regional scale as we do here in Metro Vancouver, not everybody's created equal. So when you have impacts of a regional nature, there are all sorts of impacts that are felt differently by different groups, different geographies. Many of these natural hazards become an equity issue when you're struggling with impacts. And there are massive data gaps. So you have communities that are taking on exercises on their own to come up with their own solutions, but without a regional approach dealing with issues when you have haves and have-nots in the region. How do you deal with that kind of complexity?
Well, I'll offer something. I mean, it's obviously correct. One municipality doing something, like if you take my fire and smoke issue, one municipality doing something doesn't necessarily help them if the next door one has a problem, right? A fire or whatever. So I guess that's where I see the Metro Vancouver bringing the players together and saying, hey, we're all in this. Like if a big fire were to happen and our valley got inundated with smoke even worse than what we've got from California and whatnot, what would happen? We'd be in big trouble. And so we're all in this together. We should do something.
I think just to build on James's comment, one of the things is that within Metro Vancouver, even our jurisdictions have different levels of resources, and so whether it's a small municipality or some of the in-region First Nations, or are quite different than the city of Vancouver or city of Surrey, and so I think one of the things that we as Metro Vancouver have, we try to support all our members in different ways to the needs that they have. But when we're talking about some big risk events, whether it's climate change or earthquake, I think, or others, we being able to have the tools necessary to distribute resources as needed, both in pre and planning for those events and also post events is still a bit of a challenge with the tools that we have.
Yeah, and just sort of following up on that, I guess I'd like to pose to the group if there's a sense that we we have enough data, we have the information that we need to make some of these considerations at the regional scale? Are there some pretty glaring gaps where we really don't have that data? So sort of just in terms of what we have and what we still need, are there any sort of glaring gaps that this group can identify, particularly when we're looking at that regional scale and looking at the data that can help us inform some of our policies and decision making and distribute those resources as well to the local level?
I think kind of on that note, when you look at, let's say, hazard or risk mapping across the region, different municipalities have different scales of their data and different, anyways, the mapping itself ends up having weird boundaries between regions, so that in one region it might look really hazardous, in another it doesn't. So that makes it really difficult to paste all these together and try to have a regional scale idea of risk. So that's a big problem, is individual zones doing their own work, but it not matching up nicely. So it makes it difficult to make decisions based on that.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. And I think that's exactly something that we've identified thus far, is that it seems to be in some cases a bit of a patchwork of data sets that we're trying to pull together cohesively here at the regional scale. But in some cases, it might be helpful if we're sort of all working from the same playbook. And I think that's another piece to this puzzle, is sort of how can we ensure that we're all working with the most up to date data at the right scale, to be used the correct way. So thanks for raising that.
And I think I saw in the chat, it's not just about the data; it's coming up with a common framework for the use of the data. We struggle with looking at projections for riverine and sea level rise. There's all sorts of ways you can slice the data, and nobody knows, because you can't look out 50 and 100 years with any kind of certainty. So if everybody is using the same data, how do you ensure that it's kind of interpreted the same way or sliced the same way? I think we've all seen people use data in completely counter arguments, the same data, right? How do you get people on the same page with the use of that data is another risk.
Can I have a little bit of maybe a pushback on data? I recognize sometimes there are data gaps, and particularly like in risk assessments, you need to know what probabilities are and whatnot. But I wonder if we really, in the planning stage, if we really need to know exactly, the probabilities, but we know the consequences are bad enough that if it were to happen, so what if, yeah, this is bad, we need to do something. Now, I recognize, of course, the amount of resources mobilized might, need a little bit of a risk assessment, but so I think we can do a lot without, or maybe I should say, sometimes we're using the excuse of not having enough data to stop us from taking appropriate action.
I'd like to second that, actually. Working in the data world, I know that data is not perfect, and it seldom is. And the best analysis is from people who truly understand the data sets, and that is not always the people who are actually doing the end analysis. And a lot of what research is about is advancing your data set and taking what is imperfect data and moving forward with that. And I think in many cases, we just have to take what we have now and push forward and then reevaluate. And it's a constant process of reevaluation over time. And yes, our minds will change over time. And that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, so Jamie, you almost flagged like an issue related to getting lost in translation, when you're just sort of mentioning that, and certainly that can be the case with some of these data sets where there's, 25 different scenarios and you have to look through a 300 page PDF to sort of really understand some of the key assumptions that went into that data and some of the caveats. So no, I think that's a great point.
Yes, and I'll just give a quick example from my own field. I'm an earthquake seismologist, and I work, I know the data set extremely well, and we'll often see researchers at universities, for example, who use the publicly available data, don't necessarily contact us. And, most people do, but sometimes it doesn't happen. And there have been cases where they've, missing areas of seismicity have been discovered. And then once we become aware of what's happening, we're able to translate this as, well, that was all road work in a given region. It wasn't earthquakes at all. And, you know, things again are improving, and these get labeled now as the fact that they're blasts, but we don't always know initially. And that's one small example.
If I may build on that point, which I completely agree, scientifically and also data availability in many aspects of risk and understanding the impacts, the science is not still advanced enough, or the data is not available. So completely agree with that point, that we should accept its gradual progress. We should use information that we have, but still think about it intelligently, about its uncertainties and in its limitations. But one of the challenges we are facing, which I think many people have already brought it up, is the other side of the problem, that in many cases, the science has advanced. We do have that information. We just don't know that it exists in our own region. We don't know where to find it. We don't know who to talk to. So these are two different challenges. One, we have more control to get more organized and find better systems to know where to find the information.
Maybe I can just add another comment on the data comment. One of the things I think, at least in the climate space, that we are always, I think, we're challenged with is translating climate data, climate science data, and information into useful forms for the decision makers that are making other types of decisions. So one example is translating climate data into rainfall projections for engineers who do designing of infrastructure. So that's some work that we've done at the University of Waterloo has done to translate, take those climate projections that are useful for understanding at a high level what the climate change, how it will change, but then helping our engineers figure out how we're going to design the pipes and the drainage systems and other things into. And so I think that's probably one example, but I think there are probably other ways that this data needs to be and information needs to be translated into something that's useful to either engineers, but also our political decision makers, so they can really understand what the implications of one decision or another is when they're making policy decisions. So that, I guess, would be something I'd throw out to the group if there are some other examples of that, and specifically at a regional scale, how we need to downscale maybe provincial level data or upscale municipal data to be useful to make regional level decisions.
I'm currently facing something similar in our research. I'm a master's student at Western, and we are with EMBC updating the regional earthquake hazard kind of data set, looking at a lot of the geological conditions and soil and everything like that, soil amplification. And a lot of problems that we're having with this is that planners and emergency managers look at the data and the maps we produced, and they don't actually understand them or know how to then put those into use in the future. So I think there is this huge gap between people who produce this information and the actual practical users of it. And it's still super obvious that this exists, and even through sessions with stakeholders, it's hard to figure out how to move that forward. And I definitely understand that that is a very common problem for all of these hazards and all of this these risk problems, is translating this knowledge and bridging this knowledge gap, especially with earthquakes.
Well, one thing I hope is related, but it sounds like sometimes we need to think about hazards and sometimes we need to think about risks. Risks inherently need more data, but the engineering information, for example, that was used by Jason. But hazard is a little bit more like once you define it, now you just identify it and you find out where it is, and then you say, now is this going to be a problem, or should we deal with it? So we need to go with both, because sometimes I've heard people say, well, we need to move away from hazards or consequences and look at just risk. And well, I think it's both and, right?
If I could just jump in for a second, I would, it's Jessica here. I would maybe just ask Murray if he wanted to use his voice to discuss some of the things he's put in the chat, because they're really valuable. And I think they're, with these UR symposiums, we really try and focus on solutions, not just challenges. And I think there is some ongoing work. Murray was referring to the regional earthquake and flood modeling and the developments that have been made in terms of developing basically a good exposure model for the region. So Murray, did you want to jump in and comment on the two things you put in the chat perhaps?
Just really briefly, the question I posed there was, what if we could attach everything that we know about hazards and risks to the buildings in the BC assessment inventory that we use on a regular basis to inform planning and policy development, so that that information is accessible to any local authority that uses BC assessment data for their planning purposes. We understand that risk assessments can be very complex and they involve a lot of information, but they have a lot of things in common. And one of the key things they have in common is a description of the built environment, the types of buildings that are on the ground, the numbers of people that are in those buildings, and it would be impacted by any hazard, regardless of whether it's a flood, wildfire, earthquake, or whatever. And so that's a really common, an important foundational element if we're going to move toward a coherent multi-hazard risk framework for the region. We're testing this idea right now in a project. We have been able to attach both earthquake risk and flood risk information to individual buildings for the whole metro region. We've been able to attach business listings to those same buildings. So we know that if a building is impacted by a hazard, what the reduction and what the implications of that might be. The second thing I would say is we're moving toward professional guidelines for doing risk assessments in the province, and we've made great progress. And I think that's the second piece of the puzzle. If everyone who's conducting a risk assessment, and many of these risk assessments are done by private consultants with the best information and capabilities at hand, if we're all using the same input data and we have a set of guidelines that help anyone doing those risk assessments use that input data to generate the results, then I think we can move toward addressing the challenge, James, that you put out there, that the results that we get out of the risk assessments can be used as a reliable base of evidence to inform decision making within any local authority within the region, because we would know that it's based on the same input data and uses the same guidelines, same set of guidelines for doing the risk assessments.
This is Tamsin. I just wanted to connect what Murray's talking about to something Sahar said, and I think one of the pieces that could strengthen the use of all this is governance. I think there's a multitude of different actors doing this work, from emergency managers to engineers, as Jason said, to planners. And I don't think everybody knows where the information is, how to use it, what's being done at the region, how risk assessment at the region it's feeding into the different planning strategies, such as Transportation 2040. So I think as per Sendai, strengthening the governance and organization for resilience is an important step to pull these pieces together.
And I just wanted to say, Tamsin, that was a perfect segue, because one of the challenges that we identified for the second breakout session, which I think we'll now just maybe speak to verbally as part of this plenary, was the idea that we are kind of working in silos in this space in some cases. So many times we have land use planning or transportation planning working perhaps in isolation from emergency managers in the region, who are also potentially working in isolation from those who are looking at climate change specific hazards. And so I think you raised a great point that we're trying to grapple with at the regional scale, which is, and it does relate to data as well, is sort of how do we sort of all work from the same play sheet here? And that, I think that applies to data, but I also think it applies to shared policy directions as well. We're looking towards this resilient region by the year 2050. How do we work together, particularly at the regional scale, where that seems to be some part of the inherent role at the regional level, is this collaborative role. And so I just sort of put that to the group, if anyone else has any thoughts on sort of how these different disciplines can maybe start to work together, either as it relates to data or through shared policy direction.
Edward, it's Trisha here. Just wanted to jump in and highlight some of the work that IPRM's been doing, and I think it's very pertinent to the conversations we've been having. So in 2018, we did a GIS-specific forum that highlighted that need for consistency within the data layers and how they were being used. But then that has also been highlighted through some of our workshops and exercises that we've undertaken, particularly the exercise we had last year in 2019. And that had a focus on disaster debris management. It was bringing together subject matter experts, solid waste engineers, GIS professionals, as well as emergency managers from across the region to have those robust conversations. I think that's really where we can start fleshing out what those needs for data are. And it's just setting us on a path for success going forward. Additional input on those would always be welcome through IPRIM and other organizations. I'm sure would be interested in hearing that. Anyways, I just wanted to put that on the table and kind of share some of the work we've done and what we've heard at a regional level to support some of these broader initiatives within Metro Van.
Thanks for that best practice, Trish. I was just wondering, were there any sort of factors for success that stand out to you in terms of the collaboration that came together as part of that project that we might be able to glean some lessons learned from?
Edward, can I pose a question maybe to get juices flowing in that area? What about a reluctance to break down the silos? Some of the things that I was hoping we could explore in these breakout groups is around the governance and the politics, and the fear around discussing disaster and risk when it comes to individuals, but also the momentum that has driven growth, especially in this region over the last 100 years. There is a path, and you can't just change direction overnight. So there can be a real reluctance to have these conversations. It's great to talk about the need to break down silos and share information, but if there's an inherent resistance to that, like what can be done around that to break down that resistance to get to those silos? Any thoughts on that?
So I think there are a couple of things at the heart of that lack of tendency to break the silos. One is the cultural aspect, just the culture of how we function in our own groups, in our own teams, in our own setups, resources that it takes to open up and have that conversation outside of our silos. The language even changes when you go from one hazard to another, let alone when you go from science to policy. But another aspect that is quite important and can make a big difference is the legislation that can back up or require data sharing, require use of risk information, and require, for example, multi-hazard view towards whenever you want to have an investment or a new policy or a new plan. On the culture side, I think things such as the project that IPRIM mentioned can make a big difference. We had a small project, kind of a research going around talking to the GIS units of few municipalities to better understand how they're accessing risk data. And few of them, actually all of them, the ones who had participated, they mentioned that project as the only thing they could think of in recent history, that a project that brought them together and connected them to talk and share, talk their practice, and get to even know each other, two municipalities side by side. So we can see, we heard from the other side about the success of the project that was just mentioned, how it could help with breaking the silos.
Maybe I'll build on Sahar's comments there. I think one of the things that, at least in some of the space we're working in, is that, time and resource constraints, sometimes are one of the main barriers to those cross collaborations, and it takes an outside catalyst to try to, and some outside resources to help, break those barriers down. But I think in an ongoing, systemic way, some of these areas just need to be better resourced in order to allow space and enough staff time or enough resources to be able to actually, in an ongoing way, create these cross collaborations. So I'll just throw that out there as one constraint.
I think something that's come up for me as well is just sort of, how some of these different processes can potentially fit together. I mean, I know something that we've talked about just informally with IPRIM before is, at the regional scale here, we're looking at where future urban growth will be concentrated. TransLink is obviously looking at transportation infrastructure investments. And, I think one aspect that we're interested in is sort of how does that relate to the emergency management process and in terms of that sphere? And are there any sort of considerations that we can be thinking about in terms of our planning and our policies that may sort of reduce the burden for emergency management later on? And so, I think that's probably easier said than done, but certainly something that's been on our radar as we look to find some synergies across these silos.
Well, if I could mention one silo, sort of a silo. I'm an engineer, and engineers and geoscientists BC are developing a climate change action plan. And one of the things that we've talked about when we say, well, maybe we should do this or should do that, is we say, well, that's a choice of our clients, or that's the choice of the developer, or the planner, or the architect. So you sort of feel, yeah, well, we can't do that. We're overstepping our jurisdiction. So I think it's very real. I don't know how to deal with it other than some suggestions we had of trying to work together, bringing everybody into the same room, and also educating, sharing our concerns.
Yeah, I think public education is a critical piece of this work. There's a lot of information out there. We hear a lot about what the market wants, and developers are pushing a certain product in certain areas and claiming that's what the market wants, but the market only knows what's available to it and what the true benefits and risks are if it's communicated to them. And it's often hidden away through glossy artist concepts around development or community building, and the elected officials or the decision makers respond to that. And I think they don't want to create this mass hysteria, but still there needs to be a way to communicate risk out to not only decision makers, but the public in a easily digestible way that cuts through the data and the technical aspects of it.
And I think you hit on a really key point there, James, in terms of some of the hurdles here is that we need to be able to have those frank conversations about risk and resilience and hazards. And in some cases, that can certainly be a challenge at the political level. It can be a challenge with the general public. And to some of the points you were making around development, I think that can also be a challenge, particularly in communities that have a development legacy and development history in areas that are, perhaps already considered at risk. So I'm curious to sort of float that to the group to see if there are any folks have any sort of wisdom they may want to impart on us in terms of navigating some of those political hurdles, navigating some of that development history in at-risk areas, and how we sort of communicate these challenges to these other audiences.
Hi, my name's Anna. I've just had a thought. So I work in the States, so forgive me if I kind of say anything that sounds weird in the Canadian context, but I grew up in Vancouver. So I work with local elected officials with the National League of Cities. And one thing that really resonates with them there is the idea of the cost of inaction. So if you're thinking about, this project is going to cost this amount of money, this plan is going to scare residents, it's going to reduce our tax revenue, et cetera, framing it as what if you do nothing? And we're seeing this play out in real life in Oregon and California, in places that are very close to us. So we're not really in that space anymore where it's okay to just ignore this idea. Like, it's no longer okay. And so I think there is really a culture of the overall level of capacity and education, I think within metro, like the metro region in Vancouver and in BC and frankly, and in Canada in general, is pretty high. And I think, leveraging the existing structure of Metro Vancouver is so important, because most cities don't have this. In a way, you guys are really lucky to have this, right? A lot of cities struggle to come together and create these multi-county jurisdictional interlocal agreements, and they put in $50,000 each and barely scrape something together. And it's like, Metro Vancouver already has this established pathway. And so to push that and leverage that as much as possible, who cares if you offend people at this point? There's no time to waste. We don't have time. This is it, right? So I think just pushing that is so important, and really appreciating that we have this structure in place already when many regions don't. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
Can I follow up with Anna's comments? Because I think those are really important. So the Metro Vancouver model has a lot of strengths. You know, the consensus-based consensus, or kind of the collaborative model. But I think one of the things that we're thinking about is how can we strengthen that model to really deal with kind of some new, around the climate change, some new risks, and where do we need to strengthen that model? What are there additional tools or powers that the province maybe should be thinking about for regional districts, and not just Metro Vancouver, maybe regional districts overall across the province? Because if this model has the strengths of collaboration, are there certain things that Metro Vancouver should be mandated or empowered to do beyond what it does now in terms of collaboration? Because I think, you know, if we can't move fast enough or have enough tools, maybe some sticks, maybe some incentives that can actually get our members and others to move a bit faster, we may still not be ahead of the curve enough to be able to deal with the events as they come. So I'll just throw that out to the group. That kind of goes into one of our breakout questions: is what is the regional role in kind of addressing these new multi-layered risks?
Jason, to your point, just an additional comment. Consensus is not always a strength. And I think it's great to have a consensus-based model most of the time, but consensus is not always achievable. And sometimes, and this goes back to my earlier comment, when you have winners and losers from climate change impacts or equity impacts or public money investment impacts across a broad region, it's really tough to get people to the table that have the same interest in arriving in consensus. There comes a time where majority should rule, or there should be legislation that comes from the top to get through the silos and inaction we were just talking about. Are there any thoughts on that? I mean, I don't want to appear draconian, but my experience is sometimes you're striving for consensus that's just not achievable.
I would jump in, James, with a quick comment and just say I agree. Like, I think even in putting together this session, you know, we talked about being, you know, honest. I think Metro Vancouver does a really good job of it in terms of what Metro is capable of doing, right? Like, what does Metro actually have authority to regulate or manage, and where does Metro play that convening role, versus, you know, what are the elements that are still a challenge for Metro? And I think we consistently hear, you know, land use planning is still a challenge, right? Because it's through consensus in Metro, and it's always a challenge. It's always been a challenge. So, and I mean, I think this has also come up in terms of the regional flood strategy, where the Fraser Basin Council is doing an amazing job. They're able to, you know, push forward on the risk assessment, the regional risk assessment, for example. They're able to push some of those pieces along, but they also get criticized at the end of the day for not having that kind of regulatory authority to make certain things happen. So I think looking at, you know, you need that governance map. I think going back to Tamsin's point, which she was making more in relation to data, but it applies across policy and action as well, which is understanding, you know, who's able to push in which spaces, and then, you know, where are the kind of remaining gaps.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that point, Jessica. You know, I think that is part of the reason that we do have an interest in data is partly because some of these risks and hazards have implications at the regional scale, but also because data distribution and knowledge sharing and convening sort of fits well within the Metro Vancouver role, which is part of the reason why we want to touch on that. But I do think in general, this does raise an interesting question about how we can sort of partner up and and leverage the strength of others in this region to address some of these challenges. Yes, there are limitations to the regional role, but we also heard from Anna, there are also strengths to the regional role. And so I think some of the conversation that has been put forward thus far has been really valuable, but it is something I'm thinking about, is just in terms of leveraging some of the strengths of these different agencies across the region in their role in this space. So I'm not sure if anyone has any other thoughts on that as well.
Just a quick thing, a quick idea, just kind of sparked based on what Jessica said and what Jason said. So if Metro can leverage its role as the convener and create a kind of a region-wide resident engagement strategy that each muni can go back and each staffer can go back and then work on in their individual municipality, I mean, that's super powerful, because then if everyone in, say, West Van knew how dangerous it is to keep building further and further into the WUI, and if they really understood those risks, they would pressure their council members to vote against these projects. Right now, most people don't know. I can tell you for a fact, they have no idea. And so that communication aspect is so important. Like people understanding the risk will pressure their elected leaders, who then can come to the table and say, here's what my residents want. So I think the benefit of having Metro and as a convener can then help educate staff in these individual municipalities on a collective strategy. So this doesn't even have to be a policy. This is just something that everyone comes together and sort of agrees to, because obviously there's a different level between staffers and electeds, right? So I don't know, just a thought.
Actually, that's a great observation, and my experience with working at a local municipality in this region was kind of came to a head around interface fires and the premium that homeowners pay to be adjacent to wooded areas, to have views, and if you're proposing anything that improves safety or reduces risk from wildfires in that area, it is met with public resistance because of those reasons, that they paid a premium to have that nice wooded area adjacent to them, or they paid a premium to have a certain view. And when you're making changes, it's often met with resistance, and then of course that ends up in the political arena. So I think this goes back to the earlier conversation about people really understanding what the benefits and risks are of these different elements is a key piece of kind of bringing everybody along. We meet in these forums like this, and we're all kind of technical experts at different levels, and we all speak a similar language, but the language of decision makers and the language of the public is very different. And they're nowhere near the same page that we're sitting on right now in this call.
Yeah, it's a great point, James, and I like your idea there about the shared strategy. And I also think, part of the reason that we're convening this session is, again, because we're developing this regional transportation strategy, regional growth strategy, regional climate action strategy, all with that same time horizon extending out to the year 2050, and all kind of within a similar time frame. And Metro Vancouver is, of course, working in close collaboration with TransLink on the development of these policies. And so, just from a communication perspective, I think it is a really neat opportunity to integrate the concept of resilience and communicate the importance of resilience throughout all three of these plans. It's sort of a unique opportunity in that regard.
To Tammy's point about Vancouver, Victoria, I assume maybe you mean the region, but maybe just the cities, but across those regions, Metro Vancouver region or the Capital Regional District, I think one of the things is that we don't, at least in Metro Vancouver, we don't really have a clear mandate on climate adaptation, for example. And so there's not like a clear mandate that says Metro Vancouver will, help its member jurisdictions or support its member jurisdictions to prepare for climate change. There's not anywhere clearly in the legislation or in our service bylaws that define what the services we provide to our members. And so and an earthquake, probably Tricia and the folks from IPRIM can probably comment on this a little bit more, but even in the other disaster management, that's kind of left to IPRIM and others. And so, how having some more clear direction on that this is a service we should be providing to our members would, I think, strengthen our ability to do a lot of the things that we're talking about today, around data provision, around creating specific policies in the space. Right now, we're working within a framework that has broad, we're supposed to be dealing with broadly with regional issues, but it doesn't specifically define what Metro Vancouver's role should be in this space or any other regional district as far as I know. So I just kind of throw that out there to the group.
And just to speak to that from the perspective of IPREM, similarly, we don't have authority to make large changes. Everything that we do is, again, sort of that convener role and information exchange and sharing within emergency management within the Metro Vancouver region. So the authority for action around emergency management rests within each individual local authority. So just to clarify that and add similar kinds of issues to what the regional district would experience.
And as we've seen recently with the pandemic, when emergency operations centers are convened, as with any natural disaster or risk, the perception generally is that they're point in time shocks, and the focus is getting back to normal. Right? It's an interesting phenomenon. It's all about patching up what's broken, getting people back to the way they were before, making sure that everybody's reassured that everything's under control. But I think what we're seeing now, especially with this pandemic, is that the normal is just exposing us to future risk. So how do you introduce change at the time that you're trying to reassure people that you're patching things up and everything's going to get back to normal? When people are out of work, when people are sick or unhealthy or can't move around the region, it becomes a real communications challenge to talk about failing forward rather than just we're going to fix this and get back to normal. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, James, I'll jump in on that. You've as part of your regional growth planning, you've adopted scenario planning as a way of looking at potential future outcomes of choices that might be made today. And the outcomes, somewhere down the road. We actually have the ability to do that for disaster risk management as well. We can look at future outcomes for recovery in the region with different choices made now. And I think a really important part of this conversation is this whole idea around policy targets. They exist for disaster risk reduction. And I think there's an opportunity for us as a region to come together to start articulating what might be some targets that the region might set for itself for risk reduction that local authorities could take on as part of their growth management, their land use planning, just like we do for other areas, whether it's climate change or other dimensions of sustainable land use planning. We have these frameworks in place that we use, and it seems to me like we can and ought to be doing that for disaster resilience planning as well. And the Sendai framework, offers at least some high-level policy goals, and the targets are actually pretty clear in terms of things that we can do that would increase resilience and promote more social equity in terms of who bears the consequence of that risk. And I think we actually have probably a better opportunity in this region than anywhere else to implement the intent of Sendai at a regional scale and build it into the regional planning context. So I think that's what I would urge, is that we start thinking about disaster resilience targets. And our experience has been, if we're only bringing risk information forward, it's always received as a message of liability. It's seen as a way to prevent growth and the opportunities that come with growth and development. And And what we have learned is that if we present risk information not as the negative consequences, but as a starting point to look at, where are there opportunities to reduce risk, it changes the conversation with local authorities, with chief administrative officers, because then they can see what's in their authority to take action on. They can see very clearly where the opportunities are and how they can build them into their planning process. So I think it's a subtle thing, but shifting from presenting risk as just baseline conditions and pushing ourselves to actually model risk reduction and set targets that will help us move in that direction, so that we can articulate what would be a more desirable recovery path for either the big flood or earthquake. Any of those targets would help us address many of the issues, whether it's a chronic shock or a big shock like an earthquake or a pandemic. So that would be my pitch.
Great, Marie. Jason, I'm going to pick on you for a second. Can you give us a 30-second rundown of the carbon neutral modeling that your team is leading?
Sure. So we have engaged a consultant to look at what are the pathways to getting to carbon neutral, as I kind of described earlier. And so that's looking at a set of kind of major actions and modeling what the potential GHG reductions we would get out of those actions, whether it's, and these are actions not just for Metro Vancouver, but at kind of multiple levels, whether it's the federal, provincial, and at municipal levels. Things like the zero emission vehicle mandate, work around our land use planning in terms of making compact, complete communities, looking at policies around encouraging industrial fuel switching, so a whole range of policies. And so we are we're creating we're creating at this, for this kind of phase of the project, this phase of the modeling, we're creating one kind of carbon neutral scenario that then we hope will inform kind of the policy discussion that will feed into the roadmaps that I described earlier, as well as into our clean air plan. And so we hope to have the first results of that modeling work done by the end of the year. And then we will be kind of using that to inform the discussion around the draft roadmaps next year. One thing that I'll just say for this group, which I think most of the folks on this call don't really work directly into the GHG mitigation or GHG reduction space. I think, thinking about these actions and thinking about the kind of the cross benefits of adaptation, we are thinking about that, figuring out how to model that stuff and measure the resilience piece is kind of an ongoing challenge for us, I guess, or maybe that's just, we need to kind of tap into the expertise that's kind of around this table. And I noted that to Murray. Murray's comments were very useful about, indicators on risk reduction. I think is probably kind of parallel in some ways to the kind of GHG reduction piece. So happy to answer any questions about that project.
And Jason, just sort of building on that, I think something that comes out of GHG related work is, for example, that modeling project may lead to a pie chart that tells you sort of where the biggest sources for GHGs are and sort of where the biggest policy opportunities are to reduce those GHGs in terms of total amount. But in the sort of hazard and adaptation space, it can be a little bit trickier, I think, to prioritize what actions we work on. And I know that this is something that Tony has seen through some of his work at TransLink, and Tony, feel free to weigh in here. But I guess I'd just like to float that to the group as well, as just, sort of how we actually prioritize these types of actions, these types of big ideas that are being put forward. Certainly something that we're interested in learning more about through the development of our three plans. So Tony, feel free to weigh in, or others as well.
Maybe if people can think about the context of the three plans that are underway, that's our bread and butter these days. But based on that, those kind of the parameters of those strategic plans that are being pulled together, what should be the priority actions that can help address some of these challenges? And I know there's been some great conversations, some great ideas in the chat, but if we had to pick priority actions in the context of each of those frameworks, what are people's thoughts on what they should be and how we should start down a path?
I think what I would like to see, and it's a bit of a big vision thing, and it would take a little bit to get rolling, but I think we're in a great place here. I'm really excited about the conversations I've been seeing throughout the meetings I've attended this year, and you know, a couple of years ago when we had Understanding Risk in Victoria, and this is the first time, you know, I've seen these been involved in these cross-discipline meetings. And could we do something like have a subset meeting from this one that goes on in between that discusses how are we, because I think a lot of our players are here, and perhaps there's other people that need to be invited, but have something that's perhaps targeted on a given city, like targeted on Vancouver or targeted on Victoria. You know, I'm in Victoria, and I've seen a lot of buy-in from the city on trying to come to grips with seismic hazard and how to deal with it. And I have a lot of ideas how we could handle the resiliency planning and the work that we can do to provide resiliency, and then how can we, at least on the earthquake side, and perhaps some things like fires, be resilient after the actual hazard occurs? And how can we get back to work faster? And how can we provide information that would allow us to make this decision-making and distribution of resources happen in a very cost-effective and timely manner? And we're here now. We can also, you know, I deal a lot with the media every time there's an earthquake, and we have to speak to the media all the time. And during the course of my career, I've seen a huge change in public perception on a lot of what I talk about with the media. I don't have to talk about basic seismic stuff anymore. Most people know what the seismic hazard is, and I can briefly mention it and move on and talk about other things. And so if we can get the ball rolling just through this group, and then start to, you know, advertise what we're doing through the media, and maybe have events and raise the awareness through positive things like this, like we're having a fair, we're having an event, come in, see what we're doing for hazard, provide your input, and you know, start with small things like this, and eventually people will want to say, oh, look what Vancouver's doing, look what Victoria's doing. You know, if we can focus on one city that we could get buy-in from, and then just start tackling the hazard. And there's many hazards to deal with. You know, there's flood, there's earthquake, you know, all the things we've been talking about, climate change and fires. And I mean, I see it on if we can provide a resilient city, a resilient region that's a prototype, that is something, a model to hold up to. And if we can, through this, build momentum and get buy-in from all the municipalities and all the stakeholders, and it'd have to be business buy-in too, on an individual basis, and even homeowner buy-in. But to provide incentives to get this buy-in, to get people to want to help, that might start to change things on a much, much larger scale. But in a way, we have to show that it works. And we need to pick a place, I think, to start saying, here's our model city. This is how it works. And we have a lot of information already for Victoria and Vancouver in terms of building stock, with all the work that Murray's been doing and the people he collaborates with. And there, you know, because we also have earthquake hazard, and that's a huge one here, and fire hazard and flood hazard, you know, the West Coast and these cities are well placed to be model cities in that way.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I would love to keep this conversation going, and please continue to do so in the chat box.
Thanks, everybody. That was a fantastic conversation. I really hate to cut it off, but life has to go on. So thanks again for your input. I look forward to kind of wading through all the comments. There was a lot of great ideas. I made copious notes, and I want to circle back with the note takers to make sure we captured everything. You know, in terms of how your input's going to be used, as we talked about, 3 major strategic plan documents that are underway. Then in terms of next steps in Metro 2050 is completing its technical work in the next couple of months, and then we'll be in policy writing phase starting early in the new year with a draft plan out by mid next year. That's the target. So lots of discussions still to come, but we hope to have a strategic direction that starts to be publicly shared by mid next year. In terms of Climate 2050, Jason touched on this around the discussion papers. The by theme area will be wrapped up early next year, and those discussion papers will lead to roadmap developments, which will drive the climate action strategy through a series of actions. And on the Transport 2050 side, they're still taking input. This input's going to feed into the development of their strategy, but also the work that's being done on the regional resilience framework and equity will also shape the potential policy actions for the new regional transportation strategy. They're intending to do public engagement on key draft strategy, portions of the strategy of the RTS, or Transport 2050, early in the spring of next year. So stay tuned more for that. And with that, I just want to thank everybody again and turn it back over to Susanna or Jessica.
Thank you so much. That was, first of all, congratulations to everybody for using the heavily overused word pivot, but really adapting to a challenging situation. And you know, in many ways, that was actually almost even better than a breakout room would be. I know we had less chance for airtime, but what a rich discussion. So thank you. Take a look at the shared screen here. This is Patricia's work that's captured our conversation about a resilient Metro Vancouver, these three strategies that have come together to try to create an opportunity for regional resilience. Patricia, do you want to unmute and say anything about what you did, or about the listening, any of it?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'll just try pivoting a little bit. So we started with, you know, the Metro 2050, Climate 2050, Transport 2050, an overview of that, pivoted into, oh no, it's a little shaky, but we pivoted into a panel discussion of data implementation and gaps. And one thing that really stood out, and I tried to reflect what all of you have been saying here, are the differences that introduce complexity. So be that differences between municipalities, between people, they experience varying levels of impact. They have different levels of capacity, different contexts, maybe different legacies. And in terms of the more technical side of things, different scales to measure risk. And so people talked about the need for a common framework in terms of the measurements, risk assessments, but also a vision of how the data can be used. And then there's lots of discussion about gaps between data, people who work with data, and decision makers. Who do we talk to? There's maybe an inherent resistance to breaking silos, this excuse of having not enough data, but all data is imperfect, so how do we figure out a way to move on and take action with that? Translation from data like climate model projections to information to be used for design can be a challenge as well. And then, am I still on?
You are.
Okay. And then talking more about how do we break these silos, defining the role of the Metro Van region, framing risks as opportunities for planning and not just a negative thing, bringing people into the same room. There's also talk, we can also talk about the cost of inaction. So those are kind of the things that I've captured here. Probably missed a few things, but trying to get the gist of that.
Thank you so much for capturing these in this way. It's really an amazing thing to see. And we will, as you may have heard, there's, you know, our note takers were furiously capturing both the verbal conversation as well as the written conversation. So it will go into the record. I want to share with you that in lieu of a speaker's gifts, URBC is giving a $400 donation to Preparing Our Home, which is a Canadian community-based resilience planning program for Indigenous youth. And it supports them to reach their potential and becoming emergency preparedness leaders in their communities. So we felt like this was a great effort to build resilience leaders for the future and also to support Indigenous resilience in specific. So that's, we're doing that in lieu of speakers' gifts. So on behalf of Understanding Risk, I'd like to just offer our gratitude to you all for joining us for such a great conversation.